Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, Jonathan Steele. The rise of the use of food banks in Britain is a growing paradox at a time when we're being told that the country's financial woes are behind us. More people than ever are using food banks as incomes and welfare benefits are being squeezed. The controversy last week over 3 men arrested for taking food out of an Iceland supermarket bin has highlighted the desperation that many people are facing. But why are people having to resort to these extreme measures when, according to economists, Britain is on the road to recovery? Flaminia Gambalvo has more.
The use of food banks in the UK is once again on the rise. A report produced by the Trussell Trust and Poverty Action, two independent charities, has highlighted that over the past year, use of food banks has grown by 170%. This is echoed in research carried out by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who have found a decline in people's living standards.
So when we look at total household incomes, we see that on average they've fallen by about 6% since before the recession. And so far that's been primarily driven by falls in real earnings. Earnings have been going up slower than prices.
A number of charities and social commentators have said that this is a result of welfare reforms, but the government maintains that there is no evidence to prove it. In July, the Welfare Minister, Lord Froude, told the Lords,
"The provision of food bank support has grown from provision to 70,000 individuals 2 years ago to 347,000. All that predates the reforms. As I say, there is no evidence of a causal link."
The Trussell Trust and other charities are now demanding for a parliamentary inquiry into the driving factors behind food poverty in the UK to shed the light on the matter. The Islam Channel visited a local London food bank to find out what are some of the key issues people are facing.
We've been running here 2 years. In the first year, when we looked at it, we were saying we are distributing about a tonne of food, so 1,000 kilograms every month. Now we've just come to the end of the second year, we distribute about 2 tonnes of food a month. So there's been a doubling in the amount of food that we are giving out. That's a doubling in the people that we're helping. What we've seen is that initially, when we first opened, we were seeing unemployment was the big issue, low income was the big issue, and debt was an issue. People struggling with benefits for whatever reason was an issue, but it was lower down the list. What we've seen in the second year is that has come right to the forefront. So we think there's clear evidence from what we're seeing and from where people are being sent from that welfare reform changes are impacting.
Since July this year, the Kingston Food Bank has teamed up with the local mosque to cater to the needs of its increasingly diverse community.
Now, I personally, being a father, know what it's like for the children when they go hungry, and I feel quite emotional when it comes to something like that. And looking at the statistics, the amount of children that are in dire need of food has increased dramatically over the last 5 years. And so we discussed this as a management committee and decided to do an announcement. And at the mosque on a Friday, we made the announcement and then we collected some food. So it just kind of went on from there.
According to statistics by the National Youth Agency, nearly 40% of Muslim families in the UK are living on a low income. Yet, there are very few established Muslim food banks, making these initiatives all the more important. The declines in people's living standards and consequent surge in food banks might seem contradictory in light of recent statistics showing Britain's economy is improving.
So our best estimate is that the falls in living standards are now coming to a halt as a result of higher employment and returning real earnings growth. But up to very recently, earnings continued to fall relative to prices, despite the fact the economy was recovering.
The UK economy's long-awaited recovery is beginning. Whether this will ease the hardship for some of the poorest families in Britain remains to be seen. Flaminia Gambalvo, Islam Channel.
Well, joining me to discuss these issues is Ben Southwood from the free market think tank, the Adam Smith Institute, Hannah Billing from the London Street Food Bank, a cooperatively run local food bank, and Rushanara Ali, the MP for Bethnal Green and Bow. Let me come to you, Rushanara Ali, first of all. Why do you think there is such an increase in the use of these food banks?
Well, because this government has, through its policies, reduced people's average income by £1,600 a year. The cost of living is much greater because of the cost of fuel prices, cost of rent, and so on. And it means that people are really feeling the pressure. And as a result, what you've got is more people falling below the poverty line. That's happened in London and around the country, including constituencies like mine. And that's putting huge pressure on people to make ends meet. And that's why you've got a growth in food banks.
But is there something that local government could do, or is it just all the fault of Westminster?
Well, local government has had its budget slashed by a third in a number of places. In my borough, the local authorities lost nearly 70, something like £70 million already. So they're really struggling to provide the services that people need. They're obviously doing what they can, and other agencies such as, the food banks themselves and the Trussler Trust and charities are doing their bit. Churches are doing a lot as well. But at the end of the day, if you get a government that puts more onus on giving tax breaks to millionaires and won't rule out giving a further tax cut to top-rate earners while slashing support to ordinary families and making them £1,600 worse off a year, then you're going to have more people who are reliant on food banks, which is completely unacceptable in a country where we should not have to have people who suffer in this way. We're still one of the largest economies in the world, and it seems absolutely shocking that the government's policies which give preference to putting more support and giving more resources to the rich, to millionaires, should be prioritised over those who are particularly feeling the squeeze because of the cost of living crisis.
Well, obviously it's not good that people have to resort to these food banks, but on the other hand, isn't there an argument that this is part of the big society and it's good that local communities are helping the people who are less well off in their areas and giving them free food?
Well, I think it's a really twisted argument. It's one thing saying that community organisations of the public should come together and support those in need, but it's quite another to suggest, which is what your point is implying, that on the one hand, the government takes vital support away from ordinary families. Many of them are in work, the vast majority in work, who are losing their in-work benefits, who find themselves on the border of poverty and in poverty. And then, isn't it great that the food banks are coming in to help them? The government is creating this problem. What food banks are doing, which is a very admirable thing, is doing its best to try and support people in these difficult times. And so what we must never tolerate as a society is that the state completely abdicates responsibility while it leaves not-for-profit and charitable organisations to have to fill that vacuum. The third sector, charitable organisations have a very important role. The big charities as well as children's charities play a very important role. Faith-based organisations do. We need to support them, but we must never accept the Tory belief that the state has no role to play in supporting people, in need, and everything should be left to charity. That's going back to the kind of Victorian age of a society where you have no responsibility taken by government. There is a very important role for government to alleviate poverty, but also to make sure people don't slide into poverty. And there is a role for charitable bodies and organisations. And I want to commend the Trussler Trust for what it's doing. But it's very important that the government recognises that many of its policies, particularly those around the wage freeze, but also around housing costs, the failure of this government to challenge the energy companies who are raising energy prices, all of those things have a knock-on effect on people's standards and people's income.
All right. Well, thank you.
I'm going to have to go.
Thank you very much for that. I know you have to go.
Thank you very much.
There's a division bell coming any minute now. Thank you very much for taking part. And let me turn to you, Ben Southwood. I mean, you've come from the Adam Smith Institute, which is a free market institute. I mean, isn't it an indictment, though, of free market policies that people are resorting to have to go to food banks for their survival?
Perhaps. I'm not exactly quite sure how to answer that question, but one way I might approach it is, Rushrana, all the things she said, basically I agree with all the principles that she espoused, but not necessarily all of the facts. I think it's hard to blame policy since the recession for food bank usage being so highly up, simply because inequality is down to a level not seen since 1997-98, and according to the IFS and the OBR and pretty much any other non-partisan fiscal body, the group whose income has fallen the least since the recession is the bottom 10%. Now, I'm not saying things aren't hard, but I think the actual cause of the use of food banks is probably just world wholesale food prices, which are up 30% since 2001.
No, but
2008, sorry.
You say food prices, inequality hasn't dropped so much, or in fact it has dropped. But I mean, you do admit that people's income has dropped.
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying things aren't hard, and I'm not saying that policy hasn't exacerbated the recession. But what I am saying is that when it comes to food banks, I think it's very unlikely this is the cause, because the bottom 10% income so far to now is only down about 2.4%. Which obviously I'm not saying that's not made their lives much harder when you're already on the margins. I'm just saying that it's very unlikely that a 2.4% fall in household incomes for the bottom 10% is going to drive this massive rise in food banks. What I think is much more likely is that the amount of their budget that's going towards food has risen very significantly due to world trends of food production. And this is something which obviously we would like to address, and there might be ways of addressing this.
Well, let me put to you a quote from the Kent County Council, which is a Conservative-controlled council. Quotes, "The most common reasons for people using food banks appear to be changes to the benefit system, including changes to crisis loan eligibility rules, delays in benefit payments, job seekers allowance sanctions, and sickness benefit reassessment."
That all sounds very plausible, and I have...
Well, these are all government policies that have come in since 2010.
Yeah, I mean, OK, so they do sound very plausible, and they may be the cause. I don't have any inherent problem with them being the cause. I'm not against that. I just don't think it's very likely. I think that the fact that food prices have risen much faster than the overall CPI, and the fact that weekly earnings are down is essentially on its own enough to explain it. And when it comes to benefits changes, they're not that big. Until the 2013-14 year, which we're going into, benefits have kept pace with inflation, at least all the main benefits. We're only just now seeing the 1% uprating, which is going to reduce the real size of benefits. So that's unlikely to cause anything. The £26,000 benefit cap doesn't come in until this fiscal year either. That's unlikely to have caused the change in people going to food banks. There are obviously lots of big changes in specific people's benefits, and if you look at the numbers overall, pretty much every group except for the over 50s, over 60s and over 70s have seen quite significant falls, like between 2 and 10% in their incomes, and that's very significant. But most of that is caused by the recession, and by a fall in productivity itself. Productivity is down about 4.4% from the peak. That's mainly caused by oil and banking.
We can develop some of these points
okay.
a bit later as well. I do want to bring in Hannah Billing, who's from the front line, as it were. She works as a volunteer on one of the big food banks in London. I mean, the people who come to you, what do they say is the reason why they suddenly have to use your services?
They say they don't have stable jobs because the job market at the moment, we've got 0-hour contracts, we've got minimum wage is just not enough to live off. So their budget, they don't have enough for food. There's incapacity, people are ill, they can't afford to work, they can't work because they're ill. And then they've had incapacity benefit taken off them because of the changes in the regulations. A lot of times, because of poverty, it does lead to things like drugs and alcohol abuse. So that leads to them not having money because they're spending on drugs and alcohol, which obviously is a problem. But I think it's not the drug and alcohol abuse that we need to look at, it's the factors causing the alcohol abuse. So they come for food because they've got no money. And then it's not just the people who come to the food banks, it's every day we're out on the streets handing out to homeless people on the streets. And that might be they're homeless for long periods of time or homeless for short periods of time, but they're still on the streets, not having money to go into a shop and buy food. So we need to give it out to them there.
And I mean, how many volunteers do you have and where do you get the food from that you're giving out?
Well, over the past year, we've had about 25 volunteers, but it's quite a high turnover. People can't stick around for that long because purely the individual expense. You can't travel around London that cheaply, and we get no outside funding, so we have to pay for all our travel ourselves. And most of the donations come from, we've got contracts with some cafes around central London, so we get a lot from there, individual donations, and we've also got a contract with Chelsea Building Society, in which every one of their branches we have a donation box where people can bring unwanted food, or if they go to the shops and buy some extra food, they can bring it along to there, and we go and pick it up weekly from there.
And I gather some offices that have big functions and
Yeah,
parties
definitely,
and
that's
things,
great.
they give away the food that's left over at the end.
Yeah, leftover food from offices is really good because it's always really good quality. It's really appreciated.
And you mentioned that some of the people are homeless. Obviously, sleeping rough in London has been an endemic issue for many years. I mean, what percentage, if it's possible to know? I mean, obviously these statistics are not very clear at the moment, and it's fluid, the population, but what percentage are new people who are not actually homeless or sleeping rough, but who are living at home, maybe with families with kids, but they just cannot afford to buy the food in the shops?
I'm not too sure of that percentage, but we do know that since 2011, there's more than 4,000 people in London alone sleeping rough, and 13 million people in the UK overall below the poverty line. So I think 13 million people, I think there's about 63 million in the UK, and I just think that's far too high a percentage. I think below the poverty line kind of explains that they can't afford the basic needs to live off. So, well, sorry, I don't know the exact percentages.
No, let me come back to Ben. I mean, you mentioned the wholesale food prices. There's nothing the government or anybody can do about that. So what should the government be doing about the problem that people are going to food banks?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to deal with poverty is give people money. So I think that the best thing we can do is give people more money who don't have enough money. And in general, that means I support a kind of a benefit reform that's like a universal basic income or a negative income tax. They're the same policy, just name different things for different groups. But yeah, I think that's essentially the best thing we can do in general with problems like this.
But then if it's a question of giving people money, why is the government taking away from people, like sickness disability allowance and so on?
Again, I would say that the government hasn't taken away that much from people. Overall, like I say, until now, most benefits have stayed about constant. They have taken some people off disability living allowance with the... I mean, I'm not an expert on that area, so I don't actually know how many people that is. But the overall benefits bill hasn't gone down very much, and obviously, as we know, it's a political point, and I don't have any view on it. But until now, the amount people are main benefits have outpaced wages, and so it's not clear that there's much more. I mean, there are more things they could. There's always more things you can do, but it's not like they have done a drastic change in the overall profile of policy directed towards badly off people in society.
But Ian Duncan Smith is trying to change the whole benefit system. They are doing drastic things.
I mean, if they haven't actually,
credit.
it hasn't come into power though. If universal credit did come in, then I think it might be. I mean, I don't see any obvious reason why it should lead to reduced benefits for the worst off people. In fact, I can see it leading to higher benefits for the worst off people. The goal is to get a nice flat profile of withdrawal, because the withdrawal rate is a bit like a tax, and at the moment it can reach 80, 90, 100% at points, at kinks in the benefit system. That means that you effectively, it's like one of the reasons people oppose the 50p tax rate is because they think that people will supply less labour at the top end, which will lead to less tax money to do stuff with. And it works exactly the same on the lower end. If you have a system where if you do an extra 10 hours work, you lose more than that in benefits, or almost as much as that in benefits, it's very difficult to raise people's incomes overall, because you're essentially saying one or the other instead of complementary benefits and work. And I think if universal credit is done well, and I'm not saying it's been done well so far, but I don't see any obvious reason why it should lead to lower incomes for badly off people, and I don't think it's been designed to do that.
All right, well, thank you for that. We'll take a break now and then come back in a minute or two to discuss the wider issue of whether poverty is particularly affecting ethnic religious minorities. So stay with us.